reception here.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's as long as we've got the Wi-Fi. That's all. We want you, not a background. So, right. So we were just saying you'd had COVID, and how had it affect the publication of your book at all? So,
it did. I was up against it slightly with the deadline because of I always, what I do is when I write a book, I write it down, obviously, and then I comb it and comb it and comb it with many edits, usually about 6 or 7. And that is the moment we take it from, I mean, look, I don't want to sound pretentious, but it's rather like a sculptor sort of, you know, polishing down the stone, I suppose. So that's what.
Oh, I've lost you again.
Can you hear me?
Oh, you're back. So, do you want to just try turning off the video and see if the sound works on its own?
Does that help?
It might just cut down on the amount and just try that.
There we are. Can you hear me?
Yeah. It might just help. It means they've got to look at me, unfortunately, rather than you. I think you're more interesting. No, it's not working. I've lost you again. Hello?
Oh, I can see you. I'm sorry about this.
Yeah, no, it's all right. So, I mean, you were saying that you had to do 6 or 7 edits. Sorry, it cut out there, and I'm not sure anyone heard anything more. So.
Can you not hear me?
Yeah, I can now. Actually, yeah, they say that they can see and hear you, so that's fine.
Okay.
Keep going.
Oh yes. Well, anyway, no, I wrote this book. I was feeling ill and out of energy, but you just have to keep going. And got very understanding publishers, and they were very supportive, and I just kept going. And in the end, yeah, I think it's hopefully I got to the finishing line. There were moments where I thought I was actually never going to finish this book because I wasn't feeling very well. But you just got to tough it up, you know, put on the big boy pants and get on with it, really.
Oh, so I mean, you said at the beginning of your book, because I've read your book and I really enjoyed it. I have to say, it's great fun. You talk about Christopher Dixon as being the inspiration behind your writing. So tell me about him and how did you get started as a writer?
Well, Christopher Dixon was this maverick English teacher at my very traditional school, Eton College. And he reminds me very much of the Robin Williams figure in Dead Poets Society, because he inspired us with other thinking, you know, not just the curriculum. He made us really think about almost the spirit of English and writing. And if you did a decent piece of work at Eton, you get a little thing, it's called a show up, and you had to show it to your housemaster and your academic tutor.
Yeah.
And he set a piece on concentration camp poets, and I wrote a bit on it. And then I thought I read show up on it, and I thought, well, that's very exciting. But actually it said sent up for good. And that is, if a piece is considered of a standard, that it should be remembered forever. So I had to rewrite it on a piece of vellum, and it's now in the archives of Eton College. And that was the moment where I thought, goodness, that was the most encouraging thing that had ever happened in my academic career. And, but also, it wasn't just that. It was just the way he made you think and believe in yourself. And he was a complicated man, and sadly, he removed himself from this world at a young age. But he was a genius in many ways and a great inspiration.
Oh, that's very sad about him, but it's so interesting, isn't it? You get one person that really believes in you, and the difference that makes, just that bit of encouragement and being told that something you've done's good. It has such an impact, doesn't it?
It does, especially as in your teens or something, because then you start to pay attention and think, wow, you know, I really want to make this person believe in me even more. And he was a very, very delightful man, but also hugely intelligent.
Oh, that's lovely. So you went on to study history at Oxford. So was your historical interest because of your family background, or was there more to it? Where did that come from?
I've always loved history before I was connected with my family's home of Althorpe. And in fact, my very earliest school report, which I found from the wonderful Miss Lowe, who was headmistress when I was 4 or 5 years old.
Oh.
She said, Charles really loves history. And I did. And it's about people to me. You know, I love history because of that, not because of the dry and dusty bits, but because, you know, it's quite clear that people haven't changed very much in the hundreds of years that I go back. It's the same love and the same disasters and all that. And I love to connect people with the emotions of the past and the the tragedies, yes, but also the triumphs and all the bits in between.
But you're right about people being the same. I mean, I went to Pompeii some years ago, and I was amazed at how everything was exactly the same, like the bars on the corners, and it was, you could be there. There's so little had changed, really. So, do you feel that
humans haven't evolved a huge amount in the last couple of thousand years? I wouldn't have thought, emotionally, anyway, and sort of spiritually, they've diversified. But that there is cruelty in these ages, which of course you can identify still in the modern world. But the humdrum cruelty of medieval England and Normandy is horrifying, actually. And when I was researching The White Ship, that's the bit I found hardest. My hero, if that's the right word, the man I hang the book on, it's really his life story with this appalling tragedy cleaving it in two. But Henry I, he was very, very extraordinary man in many ways. He founded the treasury in England, the exchequer. He dealt with criminal justice, all sorts of very kingly and worthy things. But in terms of his own family, he made one of his daughters marry an aristocrat in France for his own political purposes. And then he made her and her husband give over their two daughters as hostages to a neighbor to bring about peace in that part of France. And they took a little boy in as their hostage. And I'm afraid Henry I's daughter lost patience with him one day and had him blinded. And then the father of this little boy went to the king and said, well, you know what has to happen now. And Henry I gave permission for his two granddaughters to be blinded in return and to have their noses cut off. And you just think, I'm now in a completely different space, because there's no way that is possible to even contemplate. But in the very simple, bloody, cruel world of 1120 or so, that was acceptable.
And the funny thing was that when I was reading the book, I'd be turning the pages and going, oh no, that's horrible. And the children were going, what's that? What's that? And their favourite was the bit about William the Conqueror, actually. That was a family favourite. But yes, tell everybody about that, because that's grim.
Well, it was so extraordinary. So William the Conqueror was the most powerful, instantly into this sort of strange nothingness, and in fact that his lords left his deathbed to rush and establish their power at home, and then his servants fell upon his body and helped themselves to his jewelry. And his body, by this stage, he was very, very overweight, and the sarcophagus, the sort of stone tomb that had been made for him for eternity, wasn't big enough. So also he had been lying around a bit before the funeral, and you have this revolting scene, I'm sorry to say, at his funeral, with the monks heaving and pushing and trying to get him into the sarcophagus, when he bursts open. And the stench was so terrible that everyone left the cathedral, apart from the really hardy ones who just saw the funeral through. But it is a disgusting scene. But I do think it's important to put this in, not to shock people, but because it's real life. You can see yourself there at this appalling event.
Yeah, and actually all these sort of these gruesome bits, we just can't imagine them now in our lives today. But it does help you relate to how hard life was for people, I think, then.
Very tough. And also, the life expectancy was very short. I mean, if you got through, if you ran the gauntlet of childhood illnesses, etc., you might live to your mid-40s or older if you're lucky. But really, the overall average was in the 30s, and that was all you had. So, life was sort of brutish and short, as they say.
And also the way that people were brought up was very hard in those days, and they were often sent away to be raised by other people and things. I know that you've talked recently about your own childhood, being very, very brave about sort of talking openly about you and the fact that you've sort of developed more recently and looked at your childhood. Has that affected the way you see these historical characters, that sort of self-development and understanding how they dealt with their lives, sort of not having, because quite often they wouldn't have parental love, and they'd be sent away to be brought up by someone else. And I think that can be, really make a big difference to how you are as a person. Do you feel that's helped you understand these people in the way that you write?
Yes, well, of course, I come from an immensely privileged background, I suppose, materially and socially. But of course, I went through stuff that is not ideal when you're growing up. My mother left home when I was 2. And then I was sent to boarding, a very, I found a very challenging boarding school from the age of 8, where it was pretty, it wasn't very nice at all. I mean, some lovely boys there, but some of the masters, goodness. And just a different era. I can't imagine, you know, I have 7 children, and 2 of them wanted to go to boarding school when they were in their teens, but, you know, I would never have packed them off at 8. I hate the idea of that. Although, of course, the schools are much nicer now than when they were, including
Yes.
I went to. But yes, it does have an effect on you. I was listening to Rupert Everett on Desert Island Discs recently, and he said his personality was completely changed by going to boarding school. And he came up with an expression which I've used as well. It's interesting. Of you have your emotions cauterized, because essentially, if you show tears, weakness, or whatever, then you are going to find life even tougher there. And yes, there is. It's very clever of you to spot this. There is a monk historian who's the main source for my book, called Orderic Vitalis, odd name, but he came from Shropshire in England, near the Welsh border, and his father loved him, but genuinely believed that it would be better for him to be sent across to Normandy to be raised for the rest of his life as a Norman monk, because whatever the suffering for the family and losing touch like that, the upside would be that he must be guaranteed, the boy must be guaranteed a place in heaven. So it's superstition, it's religion, it's well-meaning bad choices, which I think actually happened with, you know, I'm thinking of my parents. They weren't thinking, well, I want to send our son to a really unpleasant school. They were just thinking, this is the norm, and this will be good for him ultimately.
Yeah, and I do think things were different in the 80s, because I went to a private school, and I had a lot of friends who were at boarding school, and I know they went at 7, and they had very similar experiences to you and feelings about it that you do. But I do think, as you say, you know, now I think they really reformed. But I do
and actually, that's one of the reasons I loved history more, and it became a battleground, because my main adversary in the school happened to be the history master. And so I used to really, really concentrate on history, so that I would be, A, not punished, and B, occasionally I could get something right which he didn't know. And that was, you know, in that tiny world of being a little boy, I'm afraid in the 70s, not 80s, you're being polite.
I'm only 6 years younger. No, I think I'm 6 years younger than you, so it's not that much different.
The point was that this became a battleground for me, where I could occasionally get a win. And in fact, I wrote a previous book on the Battle of Blenheim. And I'm sorry, this probably sounds like boasting. I'm really not. I just want to put in context this fight I had. And I was really intrigued by the Battle of Blenheim. It's a long forgotten battle, but
you've written a brilliant book on it, haven't you? That was the award winner, wasn't it?
It did much better than I thought it would. But it went back to my boyhood passion for the battle. I was so intrigued by it because, anyway, it's an ancestor of mine who was in command of the British forces there, John Churchill. And so I'd really read up on it, and my father bought me other books on it. And I remember this very unpleasant master giving us a test in class, and he said, name every general who fought at the Battle of Blenheim apart from John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. So I literally just read the book. So this isn't, you know, I was not a genius at all. And I wrote 27 names down of different generals who fought there on the different sides. And but then we swapped papers. This is the point. I swapped papers with the other boy to mark it. And he put his hand out and said, Spencer's put 27 names down. And the master said, read them out. And then one of them, he said, was Churchill. And the master said, well, no points, because I said not John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. And I said, well, that's Charles Churchill, his brother. And because of the sort of, everyone knew about the antagonism between my master and me, that it was very much a sort of Dead Poets Society moment, because everyone clapped, apart from the master. So what I mean is, it sounds of it, but it was just something I could fight back with.
Yeah, and actually you're very powerless in those situations, and to actually
really
have a piece of knowledge.
Actually, the real key was, you know, for somebody like me who was probably always going to be a writer, the real problem was we couldn't communicate. There was no telephone. And we had one letter home on a Sunday morning, which the bullet points were put up by a master on the board, and then they checked your letter to see what you had written. And so it really was bizarre if you look back on it. You know, it total censorship, really.
Yeah, it's amazing because you're actually really good. Because I cheated a bit, as you know, and I snuck into your book launch at the
Yes, that
weekend,
was lovely to see you there, meet you.
and it was really nice to watch you because you're actually a really natural storyteller. I mean, you stood up, no notes, and just told the story, and you were really good at it. But the way that you do that, it's actually a really difficult thing to do, and to actually feel people's connection with you and read the audience and feel that, and to have gone through the childhood that you had, that, as you say, there was no communication, shut off from emotion. Do you feel that your ability now to communicate so well, both in the written form and the spoken form, is because you've had to compensate for what you experienced as a child?
I don't know. It's very interesting that I used to have, when I was feeling low at school, the part of me that used to suffer the most was my throat. And it was almost like I wasn't being heard. Do you know what I mean? It sounds,
Yeah.
it probably sounds a little bit sort of new age-ish to say that, but I
No,
have
no.
had it confirmed that I wasn't being heard. And I was very, look, I wouldn't want anyone to think I was remotely a pushover. I was incredibly obstinate, and I did not succumb to these people. And I remember I found my school reports from this school. Sorry to keep going back to the school,
No,
but it's
it's
quite
interesting.
important.
Yeah.
I found my school reports for the 15 terms I was there. And the headmaster wrote on 4 separate occasions, and he wouldn't know he did this. He said, "Charles is watching us here very closely." And I think that's quite interesting because I went on to be a
Yeah.
journalist and a writer. And I wasn't, I've got various friends who's still from that era, from nearly 50 years ago. And they were either terribly bullied. I mean, one's totally traumatized, poor guy. Another one died last year. And at his funeral, in the eulogy, his brother pointed the finger of all the problems this chap had at being at that school. And he named names of the teachers. And it
Oh,
was
so
brutal. But I
sad.
mean, I'm very lucky. Just the way I was born was that I was not going to take this abuse standing down. Of course, that makes you more of a target, but I would never, ever give up because I knew, even though I was tiny and, had no life experience, I knew they were wrong. I
Oh.
didn't know I was right, and I'm not sure I was right, but I knew they were wrong.
Yeah, that's a very that's having that kind of solid core is actually quite unusual in that situation, and I don't think I don't think that's anything to do with who you are. I think that's you as a person, that you have that solid core. Do you sorry, I'm going slightly off the point, but I'm interested in what you're saying. To have that solid core, do you think that has stood you in good stead through your life, that in different situations you
I mean, it
feel
hasn't, it
what's right?
hasn't, it hasn't, it hasn't, because of course it can come across as maybe arrogance, or you can be pummeled, for standing up for what you believe in. And I've had a very complicated time with the tabloids because they decided very early on to paint me as the sort of ne'er-do-well brother of this perfect princess and all that.
Mm.
And I sued, was I right to, I've sued the tabloids on numerous occasions on things that have been utterly outrageous. And there's never, of course, you're not going to make them apologize. I mean, they have to maybe in court. They don't mean it. And I think they just take a harder swing at you next time. So I don't know if it's stood me in good stead. Trying to do the right thing or stand up for what you believe to be true is obviously difficult when your enemies are much more powerful than you are.
But I think sometimes when you've been under attack as an individual, that you then, and particularly as a child, you then step into protecting yourself faster. So, and it's the old fight flight thing, isn't it? Perhaps you were adopting the fight strategy to just protect yourself because that was an incredibly hard situation. Do you, in sort of what you've done?
Well, I was very lucky though. Now, I was very lucky on one thing, which is that I've always been sort of taller and stronger than some. So I'm 6'4" now.
I was going to say you are tall because when I was standing next to you the other day, I was like, hello.
Yes. Well, so I'm 6'4", but I was always a tall boy. So I was never really bullied by boys as a boy. There were bullies in my school, but they didn't bully me. Just surely, nothing to do with any respect. It's just, you go for the weaker links. So I've always had that, and that stopped that. But, dealing with it, there is a direct correlation for me. Every time I've been attacked in the papers, it's taken me straight back to those, what I consider very harsh and unfair times when masters who had total power were able to make my life utterly miserable.
Yeah, and I mean, having the title that you have, what I've learned.
Can I say, I'll chip in because you've hit a bullseye there. So what happened, you know, when I was at this school and I was 11, my grandfather died, and that meant I had a title. It meant nothing to me. I was 11, it meant nothing. But it meant a lot to a couple of the masters, and they got really unpleasant about it. And I couldn't get my head around it because I was still the same boy. I still had the same friends and all that. And I remember some guy going back, we were both heading to back to the school to get stuff. And I decided to go one way and get something. And he went back to get us both a pair of gloves. And when we met up, this master came over and he said, who the hell do you think you are, sending X off to get your gloves? And I hadn't, you know, I'd gone to get him something as well. But it's, and of course this sounds so petty, but I remember it so clearly because I literally didn't understand what he was talking about. But he was bringing a prejudice into the school, which mattered to him.
Yeah, and I've noticed, because I used to have the literary festival at Althorpe, which I absolutely love. And I'm going to have to talk to you aside from this because you're not doing it anymore. I have to slap you a bit, so do it again. But what I noticed when I've been is the way people react to you, and it must be very hard for you when people to know when you meet people, are they reacting to you as the man and the person and seeing a person, or are they seeing a title? And then with that, you get a whole load of different emotions. You know, are people jealous of you, like, or resentful, like that master, or do they want to be your friend because they might have something to gain from it? It must be so hard getting to know people, and that then must impact on how you feel about your work, who you are as a person, because you're never sure if people are being honest with you. Is that true, or am I just imagining that?
Well, I think you're probably being accurate, but of course, because I'm in it rather than on the outside, it's very hard to judge. But what I would say, interestingly, I'd say I have a lot of close friends and a lot of close male friends among them. And I would say a good 70% of my male friends were friends of mine before 1981, when my sister got married. So they have absolutely no time for any airs and graces from me. And they, you know, I had solid friendships with them. What was it? The other day, I was with 3 friends, and I suddenly worked out one of them had been at primary school with me from the age of 4 to 8. Oh, nice. One had been at boarding school from 8 to 13, and the other one was at school with me at Eton from 13 to 18. So how bizarre to hang on to friendships like that. But
well, that's testament to you, isn't it? I mean, people don't stay with people.
Well, and also, you know, I grew up in Norfolk, and so the kids I was at school with there, you know, I left there when I was 11, and I went to boarding school away from Norfolk when I was 8. But I still, you know, we just pick up from where we were 48, 50 years ago. You know, we just, I love continuity of friendship, and when you can pick up where you were, it's just, you know, there's some philosophical school, I can't remember who it is, I think it might be the Lucretians or something, but they said there is nothing more nourishing for the soul than having lunch or dinner with old friends. And it's not the food, it's the what would be called banter. Yeah. It's the shortcuts to knowing who everyone is without having to put on a front.
And it's the teasing, isn't it? It's being able to... It's that they're rude to you, no matter who you are. You know, you can guarantee they'll be horrible.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing, and I'm very lucky to have friends who are frequently very rude to me.
That's excellent. I'm very pleased to hear it.
But going back to the writing thing, I was very nervous to put a book out because I thought, oh God, you know, it's going to be slaughtered. My first 2 books were very easy for me to write because one was on my family's home and one was on my family. And I wrote them quite quickly because I had all the sources to hand. There weren't that many sources, but I had them, and they're quite conversational books anyway. They're not learned tomes. And then when I decided to do what I would call a serious book, the one on the Battle of Blenheim, you know, I was so nervous. And friends of mine said, look, you're just putting yourself out there to be slaughtered. And then unfortunately, I went from the Battle of Blenheim, which very few people really know much about, into the next 3 are all on the English Civil War, where there's a huge number of academics where this is their territory. And I was very nervous then. And
not surprised.
In fact, I do remember with Blenheim, one of the first book events I went to was a lunch at the Oldie magazine, which is a rather wonderful magazine, which I'm now in the demographic of, probably. But anyway, I was there as a youngish speaker in 2004. And one of the other speakers was this incredibly well-known TV academic. And he saw me with my pile of books, sort of scribbling signatures in them. And he came over and he prodded me in the chest. And he said, "Do you think you're a writer now?"
Oh, no.
And it was so, I thought, oh, goodness, maybe, you know, you get sort of imposter syndrome. I just thought,
oh yeah, absolutely. All writers get that.
I'm taking somebody else's book sales or whatever. But then as I've persevered, you know, and I've now written, as you mentioned, this is my 7th. Look, it's still nerve-wracking when one comes out. It certainly is. But I know I've done my best, and that's all you can really do, you know.
Yeah, and I don't think you're alone with the imposter syndrome. I mean, because we've done a whole series of these author interviews, and I think everybody feels the same. And I certainly have not tackled fiction. Yeah, I'm a business writer because of imposter syndrome. Exactly that. And you worry. So, are you going to try at any point doing a novel or perhaps something autobiographical?
Yeah, I'd like to give it a go. I had a really wonderful literary agent. He's one of the great sort of gentleman literary agents of London called Gillen A. King, who sadly died a couple of years ago. Wonderful man. And he said, look, I'm sorry, you know, you can do non-fiction. He said, if you're going to do fiction, you have to do it by the age of 45. But you know what? I might give it a go, or autobiography, but I'd be very, very careful about what that looked like, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to I wouldn't want to betray anyone else's stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think autobiography in your position is actually quite hard to do. I'd be slightly terrified of writing something, actually.
But then I think fiction. When I was much younger, I tried fiction, and to be honest, it was awful. And I knew it was awful. No, I didn't even show it to anyone else. And I think my real problem is I don't really have an ear for dialogue. And I remember once I used to play cricket, and I was playing cricket in a match with Tom Stoppard, you know, obviously the fabulous playwright and screenwriter.
Oh yeah, well, I'm always playing cricket with fabulous screenwriters and playwrights.
No, I've only met him once since when he came to Litfest.
So I'm teasing you.
But what I wanted to say was how amazed I was. He kept a little stubby notebook, and he was listening to dialogue, and it wasn't eavesdropping. I think he just wanted the cadence, the rhythm of how people speak. And I think there's a secret in that. You know, when you sit in your study looking at your computer and it's staring back at you, you might force a conversation through your characters. Whereas he knew, and I remember studying T.S. Eliot when I was at Eton, and some of the beauty of the wasteland.
I did that too.
Yes, and you have the two ladies in London talking about going to eat something and get the beauty of it when it's hot.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that he had heard that two ladies talking like that. And it's such an incredibly clever borrowing of real life, because that's how people did talk, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's like keeping the notebooks, what they always say. So I'll do you a deal. I'll sit down and write my novel if you sit down and do yours.
I have actually written my next book, and it is completely different, but I haven't put it to the publisher yet, so we'll have to see what they think of it. And it is completely different. It's along the lines of what you're talking about. So we'll see.
Oh, so you're going to beat me to it. Right, so let's get back to the book. Okay. So tell us what it's all about. So
it's called The White Ship, and it's about this very, very famous, at the time, desperately sad tragedy. In England, we had a king called Henry I, who's very underappreciated now. He's rather dropped off the curriculum for history, but he was the youngest son of 4 of King William the Conqueror, and he managed to seize the throne of England when his brother William Rufus was killed in his presence during a hunting accident. And his eldest brother was coming back from the First Crusade. So he seized England. Then he managed to topple his eldest brother and take Normandy. He established peace throughout England and Normandy. He established the exchequer, which is the finances of the country. And he was a brave and brilliant man in many ways. Cruel, yes. You know, if people messed around with his coinage, the people who minted coins, they would be deprived of their right hand and their genitalia. So he was not to be mixed with. But he spent basically the first 20 years of his reign building up a dynasty to pass on to his son. The only one legitimate son he had. He had 22 illegitimate children, but one legitimate son called William. And so the beginning of my book is William getting onto the White Ship, the Titanic of its time, to go back to England from Barfleur in Normandy. And it was a still night, everything should have gone well. But people were so overexcited about having the prince on board that they got drunk, the crew included, and they hit a rock that's still off Barfleur called the Keyburf Rock. And everyone went down apart from my wonderful eyewitness who genuinely existed, called Barreau, who was a butcher from Rouen, who had pursued his social superiors onto the ship to get his debts paid. So it's about the terrible accident, yes, but it's the whole tragic build-up and the tragic result, which was the king, Henry I, then tried for the next 15 years to produce another male heir, couldn't do it. So when he dies, finally, 15 years after the White Ship, he's bequeathed his throne to his only legitimate daughter, Matilda. And everyone's agreed to this, but they renege. And then the man who seizes the throne was the one man who got off the White Ship, very much like sliding doors in a way. And he was King Henry's nephew, Stephen, and he seized the throne. And then there's a bloody civil war, and then a change of dynasty. So it's very dramatic, but it's all true. And it's very exciting when you find something like this, which is true, which has been semi-forgotten. Because I can tell you, if I'd written this 100 years ago, people would have rolled their eyes with boredom because it was such a well-known story. But rather like the Battle of Blenheim, which I wrote about, no one's heard of the White Ship. Well, I don't mean no one, but very, very few people have heard of the White Ship. And those that have probably don't realise that it changed England and Europe forever. You know, if it hadn't sunk, we wouldn't have got King John and Magna Carta. We wouldn't have got Richard the Lionheart. You know, all these figures would have been sidelined if they'd existed at all.
I think that was what surprised me so much about it, because there were little bits of it I did know from history at school, but I'd never really put it all together. And I think it was the understanding what wouldn't have happened if that ship hadn't gone down was hugely surprising. And I was really interested in Matilda as a, you know, obviously being a women's society, we do have a lot of men as well, but you know, she's a lovely, strong female character. So tell us a bit more about Matilda.
Yeah, I was really pleased to find that there was a slew of really good, strong women in this. And Matilda's probably the best. So she was born as the eldest legitimate child. Her mother was very impressive. Another Matilda of Scotland. And she was descended, although she was of Scotland, she was descended from Alfred the Great. So she was thought the perfect wife to bind everything together. And young Matilda grew up very learned. She was packed off as a little girl to become Empress of Germany, equivalent to the Holy Roman Empress. And she married a man who was a bit older than her, but, you know, she was given authority. When he was away fighting battles, she was allowed to judge and to decree. And she was considered a very impressive female ruler. But sadly, in Britain, they had not progressed to this way of thinking. And even though the king made everyone swear, literally 7 miles from where I'm sitting now, at what is now Northampton Station, there was a castle. He had all the great barons and bishops come and swear allegiance to his daughter as the successor. And they all said they would, but unfortunately, I have to say the prejudice was terrible. I believe, you know, the only thing in mitigation of the appalling prejudice against women at this time was that a monarch had to lead people into battle. And it was impossible at this stage for barons and knights to contemplate being led into battle by a female ruler. I'm not in any way forgiving their thinking, I'm just trying to explain what I think was the problem. And anyway, she went on to fight very well, you know, as the contender for the throne for 19 years. But what's very interesting, when you look at the chroniclers at the time, they are so biased against her. Nobody criticizes William the Conqueror or his sons for being haughty or arrogant or any of those things. It's seen as a plus. But when Matilda dares to be in any way confident, they basically say she's impossible, and people refuse to follow her. So that it's appalling. She wasn't allowed to be a strong leader. She should have been subservient.
And I think that, I mean, it's so interesting hearing you say that, because that's what a lot of, you know, women's literature is still saying today, and commentary on women. Maybe there's a whole book in there about women through the ages. Well,
actually, who did a very good one is Helen Castor, did a one called She Wolves. And it was about all the queens of England before Elizabeth. And it's very interesting. You see really very little progression for female rulers during those decades and centuries.
And funnily enough, I was at school with Helen Castor and her sister Harriet, who was in my
Ah,
class. So
that's so interesting.
small
I love her.
world.
She's a great historian and a
Yeah.
lovely person too.
Yeah, no, they're both lovely girls. So, but so I mean, obviously, there's a huge amount of research that goes into your novels. I mean, novels, to your books, and I mean, the White Ship is so full of like information, even though the way you write it is completely like popularist, action packed. It's great. It's such an easy read. How do you go about getting all that information in and making it so easy as well for the reader?
Well, thank you for that. I think what it is that I write for myself, and I am not an academic. I'm a what would be known as a narrative historian, or also known as a popular historian, because you're writing for everyday people. And I don't want to tackle a book. I want to enjoy a book, and I want to learn at the same time. And the research that I very, very early on in my writing career, you know, sort of 20 odd years ago, I was feeling a bit weighed down. So I got a researcher in, but it didn't work at all because they couldn't find the little nuggets that I love. And so essentially, I knew I had to do it all myself. So I cherry pick from the research the bits that I think illustrate phenomena. So for instance, there is this problem that Henry I has with overbearing aristocrats. So I find, rather than dealing with that as a concept, I find the worst one is this appalling man called Robert de Bellême. And so he becomes quite a big character for part of the book, just to illustrate what the problem was. This is a man who, Robert de Bellême, was very rare. He had no Christian belief at all. So he was freed from conscience, really. And when the monks tackled him and said, this is outrageous, you know, you're not observing Lent. Yeah. He said, well, how do I observe Lent? And they said, well, fasting would be a good start. So as a sort of, you know, insult to the church, he has 300 prisoners starved to death in his dungeon.
Oh, yes.
Teach him what fasting's about. So
nice.
It is very Game of Thrones. It is very Game of Thrones.
It is. That's absolutely right. The book is Game of Thrones.
Yes.
It absolutely is. I mean, it's so funny, isn't it? It's so turbulent. You can't imagine living in a time where people are coming and going. And if you were a sort of peasant working on your little plot, you'd never know who on earth was coming through on horses, probably, would you?
No, it's so true. When, you know, in your own country, you end up with the worst danger could be the king coming through with his courtiers, because, you know, if someone like William Rufus, the second king, the king after William the Conqueror, there were no rules at all. People just helped themselves. They'd help themselves to your crops, your wine, your daughters, whatever it was. They just took what they wanted. I mean, you think that's your king? You know, he's meant to be protecting you.
But didn't always do his job. It's a whole different attitude, isn't it? To later on. So just out of interest, you may not know the answer to this, but was there a point where royalty in history started to think that they had a duty to look after their people rather than just rule them in that very dominant, aggressive way that went on in sort of the time of the book? Well,
yeah, you had to present as though you were going to do that, but really what you had to do at this stage was reassure the aristocracy and the church that you were going to look after their interests. And I'm afraid they were the people they worried about. And then you just got on with it. So yeah, in fact, Henry I is considered, you know, he gave really a party political statement to the country when he took over in 1100, saying, I will observe these rules, I won't observe those ones, I think these have served England well in the past. And it was actually in many ways the basis for what happened 115 years later at Magna Carta. It was referred to then. But he was trying to work out what the basic rights of the English people should be. I'm not sure he observed all of them, but he at least was clever enough to know what people wanted and needed to hear. So I think it's like politicians today, you know, they swear this, that, and the other. It doesn't mean they're going to see it through, but it means that they hope people will at least follow them for a bit.
Yes, medieval PR.
Yes, exactly. That's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're going, so you've got your research. How do you go then to structure your book? How do you go about writing it from, you know, obviously you've got the research, but how do you go from beginning to end? What's your sort of process for doing it?
Well, I try and think how long the book needs to be to have maximum impact. I don't like longer books than they need to be because, you know, there's no place for waffle. And interestingly, I knew this was 85,000 words just instinctively, and that's exactly what it is. I break down the chapters into headings, which they're not always correct, but they're a guide to start with. I do the research in a very linear way and then drop the relevant research into the files for each chapter. Yeah, I do it all on computer now. I used to handwrite my notes, not because I'm a Luddite, but because I felt it went in deeper if I wrote it down by hand. But it does.
I understand that.
It should do, but I don't think it does, because the research takes so long on a book like this, you can't possibly remember stuff. And then I start, and the first draft is really flimsy. I sent the first draft. I've never really had an editor get involved before, but my editor, Arabella, who's brilliant at HarperCollins, I wrote to her and said, something's wrong here. And she picked out immediately what I did. So I opened, I didn't in the end, with a sort of dreamy travelogue scene of the harbour where it all happened. And she said, well, you know, I don't really care what the harbour is. I want to know about the ship. So then I give a snapshot at the beginning. There's a 2.5-page prologue, which throws you right into the drama of the shipwreck. And then we wind back. So yeah, it's structure. Structure is something you learn more and more, I think, by experience. And you know, I've written 6 of these. So
yeah.
But even I mean, even with that experience, I got the wrong structure to start with, and she was very helpful and said no. And in fact,
yeah,
you know, with a computer, with copy and paste, I still get my travelogue in, but it's in the right place. A bit about I'm not going to lose those 500 words. You know.
Yeah, I spent time writing that.
Right. And another bit, actually, so interesting, I also know that I'm going to be writing a lot of pieces. I've written one for History Today that's coming up. I wrote one for the Oldie, Catholic Herald, all these. And there are bits that I didn't use in the book, but I filed them away because you can use them in a piece. So, you know, don't just delete everything. It's all usable if it's got intrinsic interest.
I think that's such a good point, because I think there's such danger that you just go, okay, that's rubbish, and delete. Yes. And just because it might not be suitable in one place, it doesn't mean that it's not usable somewhere else.
Yeah, you may find it slightly repetitive. I remember when I worked at NBC as a correspondent, I was a sort of everyday reporter, not a news one really. But one of the other reporters, he said that when he went to an interview, you know, doing very short pieces, sort of 2 or 3 minute news pieces, when he interviewed his subjects, he would always say, right, one quote for the piece that will go in, and one quote for him, which he could borrow.
Yeah.
And so you use all the material available. If it's good, you use it.
No, that's great. Do you find your editor's been really helpful in the whole process? And, you know, how do you feel about that feedback? Because I know with writers that sometimes a very difficult stage is getting that feedback and somebody going, this is rubbish, and going through with the red pen. How do you feel when you go through that process?
Well, so my previous 6, I've not really had an editor very engaged. I mean, they've obviously been sort of helpful, you know, but not really in a structural way. And this time was the only time I was sunk. And I think it's because I was ill, and I didn't, you know, it's a new period for me. I've not done something this long ago. So I was slightly nervous. And in fact, I tell you what I did do. I didn't want to be hauled over the coals for getting facts wrong. I didn't want any help with the actual writing, but I did employ a medieval specialist from Cambridge University to go through to check I got the dates right, the facts right, the appropriate man. I mean, for instance, one very important family in this called the Earl of Chester, and there are 3 of them who are all pretty much the same age, because the title went sideways to cousins. And, you know, to make sure you got the right one is key, really. Anyway, she did that, and it was very helpful. But when I'm actually writing, I don't like anyone changing my sentences at all, because I write quite oddly, and I'm aware of that. My style is quite sort of, there's a lot going on in my sentences. And my wife said she could always tell if I've written something or not, you know, so I don't know. So it is, it's a distinctive way of writing. Excuse me, it's just water I need. And I just need to stick with that. So I remember when I worked at NBC, I'd have a producer senior producer trying to change the script, and I'd fight like crazy to try and keep it to the words I wanted.
Yeah, because words are such a self-expression, aren't they? You become very emotionally attached to your words, I think.
Yeah, actually, that was interesting because the one thing that the editor picked out, I remember now, I can just read the sentence to you, just give an illustration. So I wanted to set the scene of this appalling shipwreck and how cold it was. And I talk about a cry in the dark, and it's actually the very first paragraph of the book. So I go, looking back on this, a night whose repercussions would change Europe's history forever. Some claim to remember nothing more than a distant noise. It had skimmed across the surface of the icy sea, the sound waves amplified by the stillness of the water, their notes hammered taut by the frost of a late November night. And the editor came back and said, well, that doesn't really make sense. Their notes hammered taut by the frost of a late November night. They weren't hammered by the... And I said, no, I think, in the prologue, you're allowed to be slightly poetic. It's not, in the main body of the book, let's keep to the facts, but I'm trying to be lyrical here. And they actually did, well, as you can tell, they did concede that. So yeah, if you analyze that sentence, of course, it doesn't make sense. But the feel is what I was going for there. And so I was prepared to just say, no, I really do want that. And it's fine, it's not the greatest piece of writing anyone's ever done, but it just gives a bit more color to the scene, I think.
Yeah, it did. And the prologue was nice. I liked the prologue. It was so, because I have to say, I was expecting quite an academic book. And I was really surprised because I read that. I thought, oh, it was so much more action, and people. And it surprised me. And the prologue really set that sort of tone for me as well. So it was good to have that. So what are your top tips to other writers? Because I know there's me and there are other writers listening. What are your tips to us?
I think the most important one, important one is to choose a subject that you're going to see through. And of course, you will have ideas, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, that really seem a good idea. But I sit on my ideas because sometimes they just drift away. They're not good enough and they don't, they seem great at 3 a.m. or something. but when you think about it, could you see this through? Because of course it's an absolutely enormous commitment. My books take 3 years each, and I'm paraphrasing Winston Churchill here, but I remember reading something where he said that finding the subject for a book, it's rather like, in his point, catching the eye of a beautiful woman across the room, and then when you sign up to deliver it, it's rather like getting engaged. And he said, but there will come a point when it becomes a nagging wife. And of course, it's a different generation. But
your wife's not listening to this, is she?
I hope not, goodness. But I think the point is that what started off as a joyful, fresh enterprise will become a job of work, however much you are excited by it. And, you've got to just take that on board. And so I've been lucky now. I've taken on 7 and I've seen through 7. I had 1 that I started, but I realized within a month or 2, there just wasn't enough material, and I cannot pad anything out. Every paragraph in my books, I want to have a fully justified place in there because they drive the narrative, the true narrative. And that's what I'm after.
Oh, that's great. So now talking about 7, so you've got 7 books and you have 7 children. Now I have 2 teenagers and I need a whip and a chair to control them. So explain to me how you deal with 7. I mean, you need a diary person just to control all the birthdays when the presents have to go out.
I just did my diary for the next 18 months and put their birthdays in, and there are quite a lot of them. So I do have twins, which doubles that up. But no, it's I have 3 sets of children, not just because of 3 marriages, but I have 4 who are in their mid to late 20s. So of course they're totally grown up. And I have 2 teenagers. Share that with you. I've got a 17-year-old, about a 17-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl.
Yeah, that's the same as my 2.
Oh yes.
I've got 2 girls.
Interesting times at that age.
Yes, especially during lockdown.
Yes. And then I have an 8-year-old girl as well. And so they, luckily, I think one of the joys of all this is that they're far enough apart in age to not be competitive for paternal attention and all that. I do not have the answer on fathering at all. There have been tricky moments with some of them and all that, and but that's normal. I've learned more about step parenting, actually, because I've been a step parent twice. Once in my second marriage to two young boys, and then now to two girls who are, sort of 21 and 19, 22 and 19 actually. And step parenting is much more complicated than parenting, even though, of course, it's a background role. And the one thing I've learned for me and for my wife is that we find that the easiest way to step parent is to just be the parent that loves the person who loves the parent, and not to try and lay down any rules, because you're only going to end up in a losing situation for everyone.
Yeah, my children have a stepmom as well, and I think it's very difficult for her to start with, but she's definitely learned, particularly when she became a parent, the relationship changed, and she's now much more supportive and doesn't try to be parent, and disciplinary parents. So they get on quite well now.
Because lots of people do it with the best will. They do it with the best will in the world. Nobody sets out to be a bad
No. I think it's very difficult.
Step parenting, I think actually being a stepmother is the worst, because generally, I find people resent a sort of non-mother more than they resent a non-father, probably.
Yeah, we're back to the women issues again. I mean, they used to based a whole load of fairy tales on the evil stepmother. So anyway, are you happy to answer some questions? Because I think we've got a few questions that people have.
Yes.
So I'm just looking through it. Right. So what do you think of the Horrible Histories books and the BBC, I think it's BBC4 programs? So this is Pamela that's asking you that.
Yeah, I know they're great. I've not read them or seen them, but I know how fun they are for kids. And look, for me, anything that stimulates interest in history is such a good thing. I don't say that in a pompous way, but I just think connecting with the past, yes, you can learn from the past. Of course, there's not very few direct parallels, but also it makes life so much more interesting. If you go into a city or a town and I for instance, even down to this tiny example, where my daughter goes to school, the church was built in 1120, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's the same year as the White Ship went down. So you can connect.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, I gave the vicar a copy of my book on the flimsy premise of that. I just think it gives you a wider. It could be architectural or art or cultural, whatever it is, just to give you a view. And it doesn't have to be ancient. It can be 20th century history that's relevant. I'm all for history, and Horrible History is done brilliantly in connecting young minds with the past.
Oh, I agree. And I mean, when the kids were really small, we used to visit castles or National Trust and so on.
Yes.
And we used to go around and look for vandalism. And the kids loved it. So they'd look for the oldest vandalism, whether it was like 1420 or something. I think it was the best we ever found in a tower in Wales. But they thought that was excellent fun. So it's just getting them to focus on something. And both of them.
I've done that with my youngest daughter. When we go to a museum, we try and find an object that we know she's going to see and then read up on it. And so at least she can hang her hat on that. When she gets there, it's not just something brand new. She goes, oh, that's the painting by Degas or whatever, that. And it just means that they're not just bombarded with fresh facts. They've got some little connection.
Yeah, and something they actually like and can understand. Yeah. So I've got a comment here from Jenny. She says, I am another boarding school survivor, and I can identify with some of your experiences in the 70s. She says there's been an outpouring of very mixed emotions on social media, which has been fascinating to read. So she completely understands you. Mike Denham wants to know what you should keep in mind when you're writing a historical biography.
Oh yeah, I've only written one technical biography, because the other three ones I've written recently were sort of based on a flashpoint in a king biography. I think the biography, I think the key thing, I did one of Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who is much forgotten now, but he was one of the most important people in the English Civil War. He was a nephew of Charles I and ended up being commander of the Royalist Army, etc. And I think the thing is, there were periods. He had a fascinating life as a pirate, an artist, a scientist, and all sorts. There were a few years which were just deadly dull, and I had notes on them and everything. I just thought, no, I'm not going to ruin this by putting everything I know about him in it. I think, look, you don't want to edit out things that show them in a good or a bad light, But things that are just fundamentally dull don't need to go in. And sometimes I read a biography and I think, yeah, well, you know, we've rather lost steam here, you know. And I just think you've got to be kind to the reader and give them stuff that's going to help.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Actually, what they're asking if you can put your picture back on again, as the internet connection seems to be better, and I think they want to see.
Okay, I don't know now.
There you go. There you go. That's better. I mean, talking to a black screen the whole time, so I probably look slightly inane.
I'm sorry, the background. I had a much more interesting background, but where I was, there was no internet connection. So at least in this office here, there's something. But you get to wonderful view of the blue files in the background. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I've just got my screen hiding the beds in the top bedroom because I couldn't get my internet to work either. So we're both the same. Yeah. So Harry Kirby wonders whether it's a big jump from being a journalist to being a book writer.
I didn't find it so. You know, I was a journalist, TV journalist from 86 to 95. And I wrote my first book in 97. Brilliant training. I think what happened is get your story and does it work, you know, and picking out the bits that really illustrate what matters. So I found it very, very helpful. And I don't think I'd be able to write vividly, if that's the right word, without having been connected to television, actually. I think that the TV world has made it very easy for me to connect words with pictures in my mind.
Yeah, and I think you can tell that from the way you write, that you see it. You can tell that you see it. It's very colourful in the way that you describe. So
also a very good test. If I can't see it, then it's a struggle to get in the book, really, because I just think, well, if I can't see it and I'm the person who's generating this thought, then how can I expect the reader to get it? It's quite a good editing process.
Yeah, no, that is interesting, actually. So Lisa Horner says, would you entertain the idea of one of your books being used to make a film? Would you star in it?
Oh, I certainly wouldn't star in it, but I have had interest in the previous two, Killers of the King and the Charles I. And I've had quite a lot of discussions with people about that. And in fact, I got one at 5 o'clock today with somebody in Hollywood. Right. So I would like that. And this White Ship, you know, I also wrote a treatment on 1066. So I see this as a sort of the sequel to 1066. And actually, one of the most bizarre things is that the White Ship, the captain of the White Ship, was the son of the captain of William the Conqueror's flagship for the 1066 invasion. And they both came from the same town, the ships did. Barfleur, the same port. So no, I do think about it. Not with a sort of rubbing my hands with glee way, but look, I have no experience in movies or TV, and of course it's a huge business thing. But no, we are talking to various people who work with me. Are talking to various people about this, and I'd love to see it. It'd be very interesting. I do think of characters and think, who would play that? So yeah.
That's really exciting. That's brilliant. That's great news. So where's the future go for you from here then? I mean, obviously the films, Hollywood awaits, but what else? What else do you want to do?
In terms of writing?
Writing or work generally? Well,
yeah, so I do a lot of time I have. I'm here at Althorpe. I work here. There's a lot I want to do with the estate here, much more ecologically sensitive, more biodiversity. We're talking about different systems of farming and also the grounds here. There's this wonderful sort of 7-acre walled garden that's been fallow since the Second World War. And we're consulting on how to get that back up and being a thing of beauty. They say when you get to my sort of age, you either get God or gardening. And I think I got gardening. So we'll see. But there's so much I want to do, and the writing is just part of it. I came from a family of divorce, and I noticed that summer holidays, which were so precious, went slower because I was doing two things. I was at my father's house, then my mother's house, or whatever. And I find that life is much richer and probably goes at a gentler pace because I'm so busy the whole time. And maybe I'll put my feet up one day, but I've always had this sort of burning energy. And in fact, you know, my mother did give me one incredible legacy, which was hard work. She was a very, very hard-working woman. And that's a wonderful thing to pass on to your children as an example.
Yeah, and I do think that's true. You are an incredibly hard worker. I do know that. So, well, I think everybody's asked their question. Oh, there's one more. Can we just do one more? So, Laura says, thank you for the talk. It's been absolutely fantastic, which I would agree entirely.
Thank you, Laura.
She's passionate about history. When writing untold stories behind such an event as the White Ship, did you find out more than expected? And did it all go in the book, or will it fill another book?
It's very good. I find out so much that I'm stunned by, and little things. I mean, for instance, just an example, I mentioned Henry I's wife, Matilda, and then I looked into her parents, and one of her parents, her father, defeated Macbeth, the real Macbeth.
Yeah.
I was so intrigued by the real Macbeth because he's nothing like the sort of neurotic mess that Shakespeare served up. He was actually a hugely talented and very thoughtful king who looked after widows and orphans. And, you know, I love discovering people who have been wronged by history and trying to give them, even if it's half a page, trying to help them a little bit.
Oh, no, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Charles. Honestly, this has been an absolutely fabulous interview.
Well, I'd like to apologise to everyone for, we're very, very simple people in Northampton. Obviously, internet's a bit of a new concept for us. So I'm sorry about the dropout at the beginning.
Yeah, we're both of us in Northampton. I think that makes it simple, doesn't it?
Actually, that was interesting too, finding out how important Northampton was in 1120. You know, the big castle here. It's incredible, and because Northampton suffers from, I think, a sort of slightly apologetic sort of lack of identity, but it is a wonderful place. It's just forgotten.
Yes, no, and the castle's amazing when you learn everything that happens.
True. Yeah, Tom Beckett. Yeah.
You see, we get commission from the tourist board for Northampton as well.
I've seen their budget. I don't think we will.
Oh. Anyway, thank you so much. And this interview is going to be available on for everybody on Facebook page later. And if you've enjoyed today, then you may be interested in some of our other online interviews. So we've got 2 more happening in October, one with the BAFTA winner Ian Martin, who's the writer of The Thick of It and Death of Stalin, and one with our president, Baroness Froella Benjamin. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Sorry about our little blip earlier, and thank you for being patient and coming back. And thank you so much, Charles. It's been absolutely brilliant. Really appreciate it.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, bye, everyone. Take care. See you soon. Bye.